Karnak lay among the wreckage, his body battered and his thoughts racing. The mission had gone wrong, terribly wrong. He wasn't sure exactly how, but something beyond his control had shifted. His instincts, sharpened by years of ruthless training, told him this wasn't an accident. He had been set up. The crackling sound in his earpiece confirmed it. "Your usefulness has ended, Karnak." The voice of his commander spoke with a chilling indifference. "You've become a liability." Before Karnak could respond, the transmission cut off, and silence swallowed him whole. He was stranded, his ship crippled beyond repair, its systems gutted. His communication links severed. He was utterly alone. Pain coursed through his body from the plasma wound on his side, but the physical agony was nothing compared to the realization that had settled in his mind: they had abandoned him. They had sent him on this mission knowing he would not return. He dragged himself across the harsh ground, every movement a struggle against his injuries. The planet was unforgiving, as if it too rejected him. The air was thick with sulfur, and acidic rain dripped from the sky in slow, corrosive droplets. The ground beneath him trembled occasionally from distant volcanic eruptions, and the landscape was a barren expanse of jagged rocks and crumbling mountains. Even the wildlife, predators lurking in the shadows, were vicious and hostile. The perfect place to leave someone to die. Karnak's breathing was labored, his vision blurred. He pressed his hand to his side, feeling the warmth of his own blood seeping through his fingers. He had survived countless battles, assassinated powerful targets across galaxies, and yet, here he was, discarded like worthless refuse by the very people who had trained him to be the perfect killer. As the rain hissed against the ground, Karnak found a small overhang of rock to take shelter. He slumped against the cold stone, his energy rapidly draining. His mind wandered back to his training, to the cold and calculated way his species viewed life. Efficiency. Survival. There was no room for weakness. No room for compassion. And now, no room for him. He chuckled bitterly, the sound harsh and broken. Of course this would be his end, alone, abandoned, on a world that was just as ruthless as those who had sent him here. He had killed for them, without question, without hesitation. But the moment he stumbled, the moment the mission failed, they had shown no mercy. Just like he'd been taught. His vision began to dim as exhaustion overtook him. The acidic rain continued to fall, stinging his skin, but he no longer cared. His time was up. He closed his eyes, ready to embrace the inevitable. There would be no rescue, no redemption. No one would come for him. The humans detected the faint signal as their freighter drifted through the sector. It was barely there, almost swallowed by the static of the planet's atmosphere, but it was enough to catch their attention. The captain, a seasoned explorer with a cautious streak, hesitated for only a moment before giving the order to investigate. The crew murmured among themselves as the ship descended toward the planet. The place wasn't on any of their charts, a world so hostile and forgotten it wasn't worth mentioning. They knew the risks. There were always risks. But the captain believed in one thing above all: no one should be left behind if there was even a chance they were alive. As they landed, the atmosphere hissed around the freighter's hull. The planet was desolate, the kind of place no one would willingly come to. They didn't have to search long before they found him, Karnak, unconscious and bleeding out, hidden beneath a rock outcrop. The crew's first reaction was unease. They recognized his armor, even in its damaged state. The sigils marked him as an assassin from one of the galaxy's most feared species. A killer. Ruthless, efficient, and without mercy. They had every reason to leave him there, to avoid the danger that came with saving someone like him. But the medic, without hesitation, knelt beside Karnak and began assessing his wounds. "We can't leave him like this," she insisted, her voice firm. "He's dying." One of the others scoffed, crossing his arms. "That's the point. He's an assassin. Probably here to kill someone before his own people dumped him." The captain stood over them, torn between caution and his own sense of duty. "He's a liability," another crew member warned. "We don't know what he's capable of. If we take him aboard, we could be inviting trouble." The captain thought for a moment, eyeing Karnek's unmoving form. He could hear the arguments. Leave him, protect the crew, avoid unnecessary risks. But something else gnawed at him. The human way, the thing that had always set them apart, was their refusal to abandon anyone in need, no matter who they were. That was what defined them. "We're taking him," the captain said, making the final call. "Patch him up." Grumbling, the wary crew helped lift Karnek onto the stretcher and carried him back to the ship. Tension simmered in the air, but the decision had been made. Hours later, Karnek awoke in the freighter's medical bay, disoriented and weak. His instincts immediately flared to life. He tensed, expecting pain, torture, maybe death. These were not his people, and no one in the galaxy would have reason to show mercy to someone like him. But when his vision cleared, he found himself staring at unfamiliar faces, humans. His first thought was confusion. Why hadn't they killed him? He was an assassin, a threat, something to be feared. Yet they were treating his wounds, their hands gentle as they applied bandages to his burned skin. One offered him water. Suspicion gripped him. He forced himself to sit up, despite the pain in his side. "Why are you doing this?" he rasped, his voice weak but filled with disbelief. "You know who I am?" The captain stepped forward, his expression unreadable but calm. "We know," he said. "But we don't leave people to die. Not if we can help it." Karnek stared at him, the words sinking in. It didn't make sense. His own people had left him for dead without a second thought. Why would these fragile beings, these humans, waste their time and resources saving a killer like him? One of the crew, clearly less trusting, muttered under his breath, "We should have left him. He's dangerous." The medic shot him a glare. "That's not how we do things. Everyone deserves a chance." Karnek was speechless. He had been trained to believe in survival above all else. His people didn't waste effort on the weak or the failed. Yet here were these humans, who had no reason to help him, offering him care and shelter. His body was too weak to argue further, so he lay back, eyes narrowing as he watched them. They didn't understand what they had brought aboard their ship. He was a weapon, a tool of destruction, and yet, they treated him as though his life had value. It was something he couldn't comprehend. As the hours passed and the humans continued to tend to him, the confusion gnawed at him. Why save him? What did they gain from this? He didn't trust it. But as much as he tried to maintain his suspicion, a strange, unfamiliar feeling stirred within him. Karnek remained distant, his eyes cold and calculating as he watched the human crew go about their tasks. He stayed quiet, speaking only when necessary, his mind always working through what their real motives might be. They'd saved him, yes, but no one did something for nothing. He was certain there was an angle, a hidden purpose, a reason they hadn't yet revealed. Trust was a weakness, one he had been taught to never indulge. He kept his guard up, refusing to let any kindness sway him. Yet the humans didn't relent. The medic was always there, checking his wounds, offering food, speaking to him as if he were just another injured crew member. It puzzled him. She would tell him stories about Earth, about their history, how humans had nearly destroyed themselves more than once, only to rise again. She spoke of wars, of conflicts that had torn their world apart, but somehow, they always survived. And every time, they seemed to learn something, becoming stronger, more determined. It was resilience unlike anything he had seen in his own people, who viewed failure as something to be discarded. The captain would sit with him too, talking about the vastness of the galaxy, about exploration, about how humans had fought for a place among the stars. Their species was young compared to the galaxy's ancient powers, but they were determined to carve out their own destiny. That idea, fighting for a future rather than taking it from others, was foreign to Karnek. His race had always conquered through precision and ruthlessness, seizing what they needed and discarding what wasn't useful. But these humans, they cherished what they earned. It was strange to him. Despite their openness, Karnek couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be more to it. Why share these things with him? What did they hope to gain? Compassion, selflessness. These were concepts that didn't fit into the world he knew. Everything had a cost, and he still hadn't figured out what his would be. In quiet moments, when the ship was calm and the crew was busy elsewhere, Karnak would sit alone and reflect. He thought about his people, about how they had thrown him aside without hesitation. He had been useful to them, efficient, deadly, and yet, the moment he stumbled, they had ridden him off. He had been trained to think this way, to understand that survival meant efficiency and nothing else. And yet, here he was, being cared for by those who should fear him. It gnawed at him, challenging everything he believed. One day, the medic mentioned something in passing that stuck with him. She talked about how humans were flawed, how they could be reckless and destructive, often fighting among themselves for the smallest reasons. But, she said with a smile, they also had the ability to change, to grow beyond their flaws, to rebuild even after the worst of circumstances. That's what made them special, she said. It wasn't that they were perfect, but that they could always strive to be better. Karnak listened in silence, but the words took root in his mind. Could such a way of thinking even exist? In his world, strength was all that mattered. Weakness was purged, and there was no room for improvement. You were either useful, or you were not. The idea that a species could embrace its flaws and still find a way to thrive, it was baffling. The more they spoke, the more Karnak found himself intrigued by their stories. These humans had lived through catastrophe after catastrophe, and yet they still had hope. They valued each other in a way his people never had. Loyalty, courage, even sacrifice, concepts that had always seemed like weaknesses to him, were things they held as virtues. He couldn't understand it. Why would someone throw their life away for another? Why fight for someone else's survival when your own was at risk? But as the days passed, something inside him shifted. He watched the crew laugh together, work together, argue, and then make up. They were flawed, yes, but they cared for one another. It was unsettling. Karnak had never known that kind of bond, never experienced anything like it. Among his own, there was no room for such feelings. Trust was a liability, and attachment was a danger. Yet here, with these humans, it seemed to be their strength. He didn't want to admit it, not even to himself, but he was beginning to understand. And with that understanding came a strange, uncomfortable warmth. For the first time, he felt something beyond cold calculation. He couldn't name it, didn't want to name it, but it was there. The crew never asked for anything in return. They didn't expect him to fight for them, didn't demand his loyalty. They simply helped him because they believed it was the right thing to do. That was what disturbed him the most. He had nothing to offer them, no payment, no advantage. They helped him because they could. Karnak didn't know what to make of that. It went against everything he had ever been taught. But deep down, though he would never admit it, he started to feel something strange, a sense of belonging. A feeling that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he had always thought. The warning systems went off suddenly, a sharp alert that sent a ripple of tension through the crew. Karnak, who had been resting in the med bay, felt the familiar chill of dread creep into his bones. He knew what this was. His people had come for him. They must have tracked the faint signal from the planet, just like the humans had. Except this time, they weren't here to rescue. They were here to erase. He didn't move at first, his mind calculating. He had known this day would come. The moment his former employers realized he was still alive, they would send a strike team to finish the job. Loose ends weren't tolerated. And now, because of these humans, there were more loose ends than ever. They would kill him, but they'd also kill everyone else on board to cover their tracks. No witnesses. No survivors. For a long moment, Karnak simply watched the humans scramble. The captain was barking orders, trying to get the ship's defenses online. The crew moved with a mixture of fear and determination. They weren't soldiers. They were explorers, medics, engineers. They had no chance against the kind of strike team his people would send. It would be a massacre. A part of him whispered that he should leave them to their fate. It was the rational choice. He could slip away in the chaos, find a way off this ship, and disappear into the galaxy. It was what he'd always been trained to do, survive, no matter the cost. His life had always been about survival. But something stopped him. He stood there, frozen, as he watched the humans prepare to fight. They knew they were outmatched. They had to know they were walking into their deaths. And yet, they didn't abandon each other. The captain and the medic argued briefly, the captain insisting she stay safe, the medic refusing to leave his side. Others joined them, their faces set with grim determination. Karnak had seen fear before, but this was different. These humans were afraid, yes, but they weren't running. They weren't calculating how to save themselves at the expense of others. They were standing together, ready to defend their crew, ready to die if necessary. It made no sense to him. The strike team's ship arrived, sleek and deadly, descending toward them like a predator. The humans' freighter, with its basic shields and meager weapons, was no match for the advanced alien technology. The first barrage shook the entire ship, and Karnak could see the cracks forming, both in the structure and in the crew's morale. They were outgunned, and it wouldn't be long before the attackers breached the hull. He watched it all unfold, his heart pounding, the familiar instincts urging him to act in his own interest. This wasn't his fight. His species had taught him that attachment was a weakness, that loyalty only extended as far as it was useful. He could leave, disappear, and be free of this, free of them. And yet, he didn't move. The humans fought back, even though they had no real chance of winning. They worked together, covering each other, shouting warnings and instructions. The captain refused to leave his crew, even as the situation grew more desperate. The medic, despite her inexperience with combat, stood by his side, her hands steady as she prepared to treat the wounded. Karnak couldn't understand it, but it stirred something deep within him. A memory, a flicker of emotion he had long since buried. These humans, they weren't like his people. They didn't abandon their own. They fought for each other, not because it was logical or efficient, but because they cared. That care was alien to him, and yet it called to something he had never known he wanted. The second wave of attacks hit harder, and the ship's shields began to fail. The enemy would be boarding soon. The humans braced for the worst, their faces pale but their resolve unbroken. Karnak stood on the edge, torn between what he had always known and what he had begun to understand. Then, in a moment of clarity, he made his choice. He stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of the blade that had once been a symbol of death, and now felt like something more. Without a word, he moved past the crew, his eyes fixed on the breach where the strike team was making its entrance. The humans glanced at him, confused, unsure of what he was about to do. Karnak activated the weapon with a swift motion, the blade humming to life. He moved like the assassin he was, his body a blur of lethal precision. As the first of the enemy soldiers boarded, Karnak was already upon them. His strikes were fast, brutal, and efficient, each one bringing down an opponent with ruthless skill. The humans watched in stunned silence as Karnak, the assassin they had saved, fought on their side. He cut through the strike team, turning the tide of the battle in a way they could never have hoped to achieve on their own. He was relentless, his movements driven by something deeper than survival. For the first time, Karnak wasn't just fighting for himself. He wasn't fighting out of necessity or obligation. He was fighting for something more. Something he couldn't fully name, but it was there, burning inside him. The humans had given him something he had never known he needed, a reason to fight beyond his own survival. As the last of the enemy fell, Karnak stood amid the wreckage, breathing heavily. He turned to the crew, who stared at him with a mixture of awe and disbelief. They had fought together, and somehow, they had survived. The air inside the ship was thick with tension as the last of the attackers fell. The crew moved quickly to assess the damage, scrambling to patch up the broken pieces of their vessel. It was far from over. The ship had been battered beyond what seemed possible to repair. Smoke filled the corridors, alarms blared in the background, and the hull groaned under the stress of the recent battle. But despite the chaos, there was an undeniable sense of victory. Karnak stood amidst the wreckage, surveying the aftermath. His chest heaved, not from exhaustion but from the strange, unfamiliar emotions stirring inside him. The humans had survived. Against all odds, they had lived, and it was because of him. He had made the difference. It was a strange, disorienting thought, one that didn't align with the assassin he had once been. The crew began to gather around him, their faces painted with a mixture of relief and gratitude. They were battered and bruised, yet they still managed to offer him smiles. The captain, blood trickling from a cut above his brow, stepped forward, his eyes steady on Karnak. "You saved us," he said simply. Karnak looked away, unable to meet the captain's gaze. "I acted in my own interest," he replied, the cold, detached tone of his past self lingering in his voice. But the words felt hollow now. Even he could hear it. The medic, standing nearby, spoke up. "Maybe, but you didn't have to. You chose to stand with us. That means something." Karnak didn't respond. The truth was beginning to sink in. He had chosen. And it hadn't been out of pure survival instinct. Something in him had shifted. He was no longer the assassin who had lived his life following the orders of a cold, indifferent empire. For the first time, he had acted not out of necessity, but out of something deeper, something human. As the crew worked to stabilize the ship, Karnak found himself reflecting on the past few days. His life had been one of isolation, betrayal, and ruthless efficiency. He had never questioned it. He had never needed to. Until now. These humans, they had shown him a different way. They had fought not just for themselves but for each other. They had risked their lives for one another in ways Karnak's people would never have considered. In his world, bonds were weaknesses, loyalty was expendable, and survival was all that mattered. But here, aboard this ship, things were different. He had seen loyalty. He had seen courage. And he had felt something shift inside him because of it. The captain approached again, his expression thoughtful. "You don't have to leave, you know," he said quietly. "We could use someone like you. A protector. A fighter." Karnak stared at him, unsure how to respond. A place among them? He had never belonged anywhere before. He had always been an outcast, a tool to be used and discarded. The offer unsettled him. "You would trust me?" he asked, his voice low, almost disbelieving. The captain nodded. "You've earned it. You helped save all of us. That means something here." Karnak felt a weight lift from his chest, though he couldn't explain why. These humans, flawed, fragile, and reckless, were offering him something he had never imagined, a place. A chance to belong. It was something he had never considered possible. But he wasn't ready to accept it without condition. "I will stay," he said slowly, feeling the words leave his mouth before he had fully processed them. "But I fight only for those who will not abandon me." The captain gave a small smile, understanding what Karnak meant. "Fair enough," he said, clapping a hand on the assassin's shoulder. "Welcome aboard." As the crew returned to their duties, Karnak stood at the edge of the ship's observation deck, staring out into the vast expanse of stars. His old life seemed so distant now, almost like a dream he could barely remember. The empire he had served, the missions he had completed, the cold pragmatism that had defined his every action, it all felt so far away. Here, with these humans, he had found something new. A purpose that wasn't just about survival. It was about loyalty, about protecting those who mattered. And for the first time, Karnak felt a strange sense of hope for what lay ahead. He was no longer bound by the life of an assassin. No longer shackled by the expectations of a race that had abandoned him. He was free. And though the path ahead was uncertain, it was a path he would walk with those who had shown him a different way to live. Looking out at the stars, Karnak allowed himself a moment of peace. The cold, lethal assassin he had once been was gone. In his place stood someone new. Someone shaped by the very beings he had once thought beneath him. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he didn't fear it. He would fight not out of duty, but out of loyalty. And for Karnak, that made all the difference. The universe was vast, full of danger and uncertainty, but Karnak felt something he had never felt before, hope. And as the ship drifted through the stars, Karnak knew that, whatever came next, he would face it not as a tool for others, but as someone who had found a new purpose.